Sziasztok! The Hungarian Heritage Podcast is back for Season 3, and we are Hungarian Heritage Stronger Than Ever. For those of you who have been here a while, welcome back, and thanks so much for sticking around. And for those of you who are new to the podcast, welcome! I'm so happy that you're joining us. My name is Christine, and I'm the host here at the Hungarian Heritage Podcast. During Season 3, I will continue to bring you guests and topics that celebrate Hungarian culture, people, and food. And of course, we will feature all of the cool things that Hungarians are doing around the world. Together, we will discover new things and review things that you may already know. And most of all, we will have a lot of fun along the way. One episode at a time, we will build those bridges between Hungarians who live in Hungary to those who live in other parts of the world. Not to mention the bridges we will build between the generations. So, if you're looking to make that first connection to your Hungarian heritage, or you're looking to strengthen your connection, then you've found the right place. Join me, and together we will connect your modern lives to your Hungarian heritage by expanding this Hungarian heritage community and making the circles of Hungarians around us Hungarian heritage strong. Welcome to this episode of the Hungarian Heritage Podcast. We are continuing our series of Celebrating Hungarian Heritage Together. As I have mentioned before, my previous guests on the podcast, Reka Bakos and Dr. Anna Fenyvesi, the editors of Hungarian Roots and American Dreams, will be my co-hosts for various episodes during Season 3 as we celebrate Hungarian Heritage Together. This collaborative series will feature guests who have contributed their personal and family's stories in Reka and Anna's newly released book. In this episode, I am thrilled to announce that my co-host will be Dr. Anna Fenyvesi, and together we will be featuring Dr. Rózsavölgyi's Hungarian heritage story titled The Story of a 20th Century American Peregrination and Its Tragic Consequences. Along with my co-host, Dr. Anna Fenyvesi, we will also have Dr. Don Peckham, who co-authored the story with Anna, and Nóra Szentgyörgi, who is Dr. Rózsavölgyi's great-granddaughter. Listen along while we unpack the layers of research, family histories, and serendipitous meetings, as we also discover why Dr. Rózsavölgyi emigrated to the United States with his family and why he and his family eventually returned to Hungary years later. Not to mention all of the interesting things that happened after he returned. Let's celebrate Hungarian heritage together as we listen to this episode. Please join me in welcoming back to the Hungarian Heritage Podcast, Dr. Anna Fenyvesi, co-author of the newly released book, Hungarian Roots and American Dreams. Anna was my guest along with her co-author, Reka Bakos, in the first episode of Season 3. Today, Anna is here not as my guest, but as my co-host in this season's series of episodes, Celebrating Hungarian Heritage Together. This collaborative series of episodes will feature contributing authors from the book, Hungarian Roots and American Dreams. Welcome back, Anna. I'm excited to partner with you on this collaborative series. Before we begin, can you reintroduce yourself to the listeners and give us a little overview of your newly released book, Hungarian Roots and American Dreams? And afterwards, you can introduce our guests for this episode.
Thank you very much, Christine. I'm very excited to be back, and I think we're going to have a really, really exciting conversation today.
I agree.
I'm basically a linguist. I was trained in the United States back in the 1990s when I got my master's degree and then PhD in linguistics. And then after that, I went back to Hungary, and I have been associate professor of English linguistics at the University of Szeged, teaching and advising. And also in the past 5 years, I started researching my own family history just for fun, to find out more about my own roots. And basically this past year, my professional interests, which are basically sociolinguistics and the bilingualism of American Hungarians, met with my hobby interests, if you like, and that is family history. So when Reka Bakos and I found each other on Facebook and found each other in the group that she co-founded earlier this year, and then and that group is about the family history research into families that include people in it that who research their own families' histories, and those histories all involve immigration from Hungary to the United States. And it has so people living in the United States, people living in Hungary, and they're all researching their own family histories. And I was totally fascinated by all the stories that I found in this group. And me being a person of, humanities and social sciences, my first reaction immediately was that, oh my gosh, there are so many interesting stories. They have to be preserved in a book. And this is how the book idea came about. And then, as they say, the rest is history. Reka and I edited this book. We started editing it in March, and it actually came out in the fall. In September, we had the Hungarian version of the book come out, and then in October, the English version. And so in like a little over half a year, we produced these wonderful books, which are parallel editions of the same book in the two languages. And they have like 47 stories of Hungarian immigration to the United States.
That's pretty amazing. People are definitely always interested in telling their story, which is really, what this podcast, how it started. So I feel like your book has taken off with stories, and I know you have so many more stories that didn't even make it into the first edition of the book. And the second edition, which is coming out, I believe, later this fall, will have even more stories. So today we have contributing authors to your book with their stories. So why don't you introduce our guest for us today?
Yes, so the first guest I'd like to introduce is Dr. Donald Peckham also from the University of Szeged. He is an American living in Hungary, a colleague of mine, and he is also interested in family history. So he does research into all sorts of interesting things concerning his own family history. And as far as I know, he also looks around for interesting little tidbits of Americans doing something in Hungary.
So like the
Right,
opposite,
right.
like that's great. Well,
Exactly.
welcome, Don. It's lovely to have you here today. I
Thank
feel
you.
like we have the reciprocal type of views. Like I'm looking for Hungarians doing cool things. You're looking for Americans doing cool things in Hungary. So welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, so the story we are going to talk about today, and this is a story that Don and I co-authored for the book, is a story about a Hungarian medical doctor from a small town in southern Hungary. And our second guest on the podcast is actually the great-granddaughter of this doctor who found the rest of us in a pretty miraculous way. And I will let her tell that bit of the story by herself. So I'd like to introduce Nóra Szentgyörgi, who is an English teacher living in Budapest.
Welcome,
Thank you
Nóra.
very much for having me here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Welcome, Nóra. I'm so happy to have you here today. So tell us the title of the story of this episode. Tell us the title, because there's a particular word in that title that I'd like to discuss first. So Anna, share with us the title.
Sure. So the story's title is The Story of a 20th Century American Peregrination and Its Tragic Consequences. And peregrination is a word that is used in Hungarian intellectual history for all sorts of trips, the purpose of which is to study or to work abroad and then to return home. And this has been a tradition in Hungary since the late Middle Ages, when Hungarian students started going to European universities in Germany, Heidelberg, in Switzerland, and other places. And actually, the main character of our story, Dr. József Rózsavölgyi, was also one of these people. First, he went and studied at European universities when he was training as an MD, and then he came to the United States. And this is where the story begins.
That's great. I actually have a question about the word peregrination. I'm also a former English teacher, so I love words. I like to investigate things. So, similar to what you were saying, the word has been used throughout Hungarian history to define people that go forth and study abroad. So, and a peregrine, the bird, flying, going different places. However, when I was doing a little research on the word itself, it seems like in Hungary, the word peregrination is only used for people going to study abroad, whereas in other places, it's more of just traveling. So that's pretty unique that Hungarians have adopted the word for so long and attached it to studying abroad. So I love words. So I just wanted to stick that in there for anybody out there that's also interested in knowing the etymology there. So let's move forward. We define the word peregrination, and Dr. Rózsavölgyi, his first step really is leaving Hungary to study. And that happened in Texas. So who would like to tell us about that first step in this adventure?
Yeah, so I basically looked into Dr. Rózsavölgyi's background, and what I found was that he was from this landowner's family, in which became part of Romania in 1920. So just from Transylvania, and then he studied in Hungary, studied in other places in Europe, and then settled in Szentes, which is the small town in southern Hungary. And he married the daughter of a prominent Szentes family, and they had two children in the late 1910s, so right after the Second World War. And in the early 1920s, they went to the United States and basically emigrated to the United States and lived in this country for almost 10 years. Dr. Rózsavölgyi got his ENT specialization in Texas, in Cuero. And then after just about 10 years, the family returned to Szentes. And we have found no indication in any of the records, why they returned. But they returned actually as American citizens. There was clear indication of that in the American records that I found. So they got their citizenship in the United States, and then they returned to Szentes, and then they lived the rest of their lives in Szentes.
It's interesting throughout all the research that one piece of information is missing as far as why they returned. I guess one would have to wonder. And I think Nóra is telling us that she might have that answer. So Nóra, please.
Yes, I actually managed to get in touch with one of my further relatives on my father's side, and she actually told me that it was because of pure homesick. So the wife of Dr. József Rózsavölgyi, my great-grandmother, had 7 siblings staying in Hungary, and it was a pretty extended family with many siblings, with many cousins and stuff. And I think she just missed them a lot. That was the only reason, I guess, the only logical reason.
Right. Well, that would make a lot of sense, and also the opportunity to move back. There were no political constraints, I imagine, at the time when they made that decision. So moving back might have been easier for them than compared to other times throughout history. And I also wonder, they became American citizens. So did they plan on staying there and then all of a sudden realize that they missed their extended family? So I guess that we'll never know, I imagine.
Yeah, I would say that.
It's interesting. We picked up this story not at the very beginning of the Rózsavölgyi family, but we picked it up in the middle of it.
Oh, tell us about that.
This is because I was doing some research about my own family in the U.S. archives, which a lot of it is now online and easily accessible. And whenever I'm looking for things about my own family, I'm always just searching about Szeged and Hungary and looking for American and Hungarian connections. And I stumbled across the series of files called the Helper Files, which were files put together by the U.S. Army at the end of World War II, where they looked for people in Europe who had helped American pilots who had been shot down, or crashed during the war. And it was a network of people who helped them return back to the U.S. Bases. And in there were files about Hungarians, and in there was a file about the Rózsavölgyi family and about their events that they were part of, where they hosted 2 American pilots who had been shot down over Szent. So this I found in the files there, and I knew that Anna was interested in her own family history from Szent, and so I sent her a link to this as just sort of an interesting kind of a footnote of history in Szent, that there were these pilots there. And then it turned out that they had immigrated to America and had returned, and Anna uncovered this part of the real American connection to the story. But it was quite interesting that after having returned from the U.S., the Americans returned. Americans visited them essentially by parachuting into their community there at the end of World War II in 1944.
Well, first of all, that's a great story to tell at a dinner party. Well, how did you meet? Well, I parachuted into town and met the family. So you stumbled across this story midway, as you said, when you were doing, I guess, was this like personal research, or was this research in your studies, or you just were doing it as Anna was saying, as, your passion?
Right. I was researching my own family and their involvement in the Second World War and elsewhere. And whenever I'm in the U.S. archives, I'm always checking to see, what might pop up with the name Szeged or Hungary in the archives, and up came all of these files, which is quite interesting.
Well, Don, like traditional to this podcast, I generally ask my guests a little bit about their Hungarian heritage. So do you have Hungarian heritage? Tell us a little bit as a sidebar about your Hungarian heritage experience.
Well, my own Hungarian heritage, I don't have any Hungarian relatives except for children who are half Hungarian, half American. But all of my other relatives are English, Scottish, and Irish. So quite a different history. And they've been, of course, in America for, nearly 400 years by this point, so 380 some years. So my connections are new to Hungary.
Those are great connections to have. So, and also, so you have children that are Hungarian, and also you work and live in Hungary. So
that's right.
Yeah. So you don't have to be Hungarian to appreciate the culture.
Not at all.
You found this story midway. So what happened then? How did it progress as a story for Hungarian roots and American dreams? And how did you both meet Nóra?
Yeah, so when Don told me about this story about the 2 pilots who ended up in Szent and Dr. Rózsavölgyi hosted them just before Christmas for 3 days in December 1944, I started looking at for other files in the Hungarian part of the internet. There's lots of documents up there, and so I looked at all sorts of documents related to the Second World War, and I found some letters that the Rózsavölgyi family wrote in order to help the cases of their daughter's fiance, who actually happens to be Nóra's grandfather and grandmother, and then found that the fiance was a prisoner of war in Russia, and so the Rózsavölgyis wrote various letters to help his case and bring him back, and so basically I looked at all the possible documents that could be found where we could get some more details about the family and about their story. And so basically what I found was that, here was this doctor and his family in Szent, a small town where nothing really happens much. And And then this quite extraordinary story of the doctor who returns from America with his family, and by the time of the Second World War, his children grew up there in their early 20s. His son is a lawyer. His daughter is also in her early 20s, and then while the doctor is hosting the American pilots, he does not know yet that his son died in the war. And the way that happened was that Rózsavölgyi's son, Ferenc, or Frank, as he was known in the United States, he was drafted into the Hungarian army, and being a lawyer, a young lawyer with a degree, he was made into an officer. But he very soon lost that rank because he went around making statements like he did not want to fight in this war on the side of Nazi Germany. And that basically sealed his fate. He was stripped of his officer's rank and made into a common soldier. And as a common soldier, he basically died in the war.
It seems that, he had some pretty powerful convictions, admirable convictions.
Yes.
Unfortunately, he paid with his life for that because he was on the front lines, as did many others. So we don't want to dismiss that either. But that was pretty tragic of a situation for him. And I'm sure that the family suffered greatly for that as well.
Yeah, and the fate of this son just really shook me very, very deep, because I thought, oh my gosh, this young man died. He probably would have survived or could have survived the war if he had stayed an officer, but as a common soldier, he had definitely less chance to do that. His sister also did things that were not very typical of young women growing up in a small town in southern Hungary. She became an interpreter for the American forces in, by then, Allied occupied Bavaria for some time. And I thought, wow, that was probably the result of her American experience as well. And then the family basically lived, the doctor and his wife lived out their days in Szentes. He became, chief of ENT in the Szentes hospital and retired, and then died at the age of, I think it was like 72 in 1960.
Wow.
And then after that, there were just very, very scant details that I found out about the family. Like his daughter died in 2012, and then there was not a whole lot else that I found. And it really shook me as a story where, okay, here are some Hungarians who had a very different life than they would have without the American experience, and the American experience clearly changed them.
It seems that was the case, because I don't believe that if the son hadn't lived in the U.S. and absorbed some of the maybe American points of view of the time period. However, the points of view of the U.S. at that time during World War II weren't necessarily so supportive of Jewish people. Not to knock my own country, I love the United States, but the more that you read in history, you do find a lot of negative things. In addition, obviously we were fighting against the Germans and we wanted that regime to fall. However, personal feelings towards the Jews were not necessarily as strong as one would think during that time with everything that was going on. So that I feel like that was a very strong conviction the son had to say, no, I don't want to do that. So it's pretty commendable. So now you've researched this story, Dom, Anna, and so now Nóra, this is the great-granddaughter. So how did all of you meet? How did that happen for the telling of this story?
Well, that's where I come in.
Welcome, Nóra. Tell us.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me express my absolute gratitude to Anna and Don for their efforts in uncovering so many details about my great-grandparents, especially about my great-grandfather. I am eternally grateful. So, as a matter of fact, I found about found out about the Facebook group that is looking for personal stories of ancestors who immigrated to the USA through a nightmare, through a miraculous nightmare, I would say. Because just imagine a couple of months ago, I was having a horrible dream. I dreamt of a boy, and this boy was about 16, 17 years old in my dream, and he looked nothing like my real son, because I do have a real son, but he looked completely different, but yet he still was my son. I remember my maternal feelings towards him. And he was standing next to a car in my dream, and he told me that he had to go to the war, and he said goodbye to me, and he told me he had to go to the war. And
goodness.
I got so terrified, I got so shocked in my dream that I started to cry heavily. And I was actually woken up by my tears. I remember waking up and tears covered my pillow, and I was really upset by this dream. And of course, I had to get up. I had to do my morning routines. I had to take my daughter to school. I had to take the dog out for a walk, and so on and so on and so on. But I just couldn't get rid of the idea how my great-grandparents could have felt by losing their son. And it was a horrible idea. And I suddenly felt a deep sympathy towards my great-grandmother and great-grandfather, of course. And somehow I got a deep understanding. And I got another idea. And this idea was whether this Frank Rózsavölgyi, this brother of my grandmother, is remembered at all. Maybe nobody remembers him anymore. And I just actually gave it a go. I Googled the name of my grandma's brother, Ferenc Rózsavölgyi, and boom, the very first result immediately led to the study of Don and Anna. And that's how I joined the Facebook group. And that's how I got in touch with Anna and Don. And that's how I'm here.
Well, that's a pretty amazing story. I definitely have like goosebumps telling that story. And it's really everyone's personal opinion. My opinion is that I never say never. I believe in things until you can prove it otherwise. So I do feel that there is some connection in our dreams and any other topic that, I'm sure that is related to that, and that people may or may not believe, aliens, all that stuff. But until you can prove it otherwise, I completely believe that. And I do feel like I've heard stories where, people dream things and they wake up and then they research. So it's really such a serendipitous situation of how all of you met, because Don and Anna, you were already researching this story.
Yes.
And then Nóra, you have this dream. Like it was almost like they were signaling to you in the universe, Nóra, that they're researching your family, and then you felt this, and here we all are talking about this amazing story about your great-grandfather, right? Your great-grandfather.
Oh, absolutely. It definitely was a poignant dream, and it is a poignant story. And I have been learning so much about my family, and it gives me a definite sense of belonging,
Yeah.
And it means a lot.
Yeah, and I find that very fulfilling that, you live in Hungary, you're from Hungary, and you still have that fulfilling feeling of researching like your own family history and genealogy. I'm not sure if you've ever been to the United States, but, we're made up of so many different cultures and ethnic backgrounds, and you could see why people would want to know more about their ancestors, whether you're first generation, US born, or sixth or seventh generation, but there's like an appreciation for you. You're a Hungarian living in Hungary, and you're still just as fulfilled by learning about your family history. So that's very heartwarming. And so then the three of you are now connected, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, so I'd like to ask Nóra to tell us a little bit more about how and why she became an English teacher, whether the story of her great-grandparents had anything to do with that, whether you have been to the United States, and just to tell us a little bit more about the personal side of what you know about your great-grandparents and your grandmother.
Oh, yes, of course. America definitely changed the Rózsavölgyi family for sure. And my grandmother was the one who influenced me a lot because her English was just like a native English right now, with a very strong Texas accent or Texan accent. And it was really, really, really nice to listen to her speaking English. And Anna has already told us that she worked for the U.S. Army in the occupied Germany as a secretary and as an interpreter. And Anna, I don't know if you remember, but I got it from your studies that the U.S. Army issued a certificate on my grandmother's work of excellence. And this certificate says that she did a great job as an interpreter, as a secretary. And it was so heartwarming for me to read this certificate. Yeah. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that I could read this certificate. And returning back to Hungary, my grandmother used to work for the Central Chemical Institute of Budapest as an English teacher and as a German and English correspondent. And she used to have many private students, many private English students, and she did it out of passion. So it wasn't just her hobby, but it was also it wasn't only her hobby, but it was also her passion. And she also taught my father, my aunt, and me English. And I would say that's how I got acquainted to this profession, and that's how I became an English teacher. She was a great role model to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Did she ever talk about her American experience to you?
Oh, a lot. She told me many stories. Of course, these were mainly childhood stories, but these were great stories. And she was corresponding to some of her childhood friends from Texas till her late 80s. And wow. I especially remember a lady whose name was Johnny May. And I remember that Johnny May wrote a letter to her 80th birthday. So
that's so special.
Wow. It was really special. It was really special. And she always referred to the United States and especially to Texas as the promised land, as paradise lost. She was always longing to go there again.
Did she ever have the opportunity? Oh, good.
Yeah, she went there like a couple of times, like 2 or 3 times in her lifetime. Yes.
Well, she was definitely a strong role model for your life, not only personally but professionally as well. So you're an English teacher now. Do you teach private lessons or do you teach in a school? What is that like for you?
Private lessons.
Okay.
I give private lessons for school children after school. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. I'm going to switch over to asking Dawn a question because this is a little bit connected to being an English teacher and learning English and how your grandmother learned English. Because in your work, Dawn, there was a very fascinating word that I learned, and it is, and I'm going to look at my paper so I don't mess it up. It's lingua franca. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah. Lingua franca, that's right, yes.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about that. I was very fascinated. I shared a little bit about that with my husband as well, because we like to talk about interesting things all the time. So that connects a little bit to Nóra's story with her grandmother and her great-grandparents. So first tell us what it is and how it's connected to this story.
Right, so English as a lingua franca is really a recognition that English is a language not just owned by the native speakers, by the people who live in the US or the UK, but it's a language used all over the world. And so it's just a recognition that there are people communicating in English when there are no native speakers present. And it's a kind of living language in a sense on its own. And so that's the idea that people are using English now everywhere. And it was interesting to think about the Rózsavölgyis returning from the US with the English language. And so it was something, I think, at that time, which was unusual to speak English that as a foreign language in Hungary. And so it would have been useful in some cases. But I think one of the interesting things is when they met the pilots who were brought to them in December of 1944, I think the pilots, I'm guessing, certainly the pilots saw them as English speakers, but I think rather they saw them as Americans. They must have been Americans to them, and these pilots must have been quite surprised to not just hear fluent English, but to meet actual fellow Americans there as well.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah.
That's pretty interesting, especially I think you brought up a great point that especially during that time period, because any second language that was being learned at the time was either German or Russian. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know that's what my grandmother told me. So to come across English speakers, and there was also another part in the story that was shared in the Hungarian Roots American Dream stories about your great-grandfather when he and two other ENT colleagues treated the insurance gentleman from Lloyd's of London in a Budapest hospital. Is that correct?
When I was researching the story, I found this article about this banker, Leslie Paul Cooper from Lloyd's of London, who suffered a car accident just outside of Szentes sometime in the 1930s and was taken to the hospital in Szentes. And then the next thing that he noticed was that there were these actually a gardener first who spoke fluent French at him, and then these doctors, several doctors who spoke very, very fluent English at him at his bedside. And he was completely shocked because, I mean, Szentes was definitely rural Hungary, small rural Hungarian town. Then it still is. And to find fluent English speakers in a hospital there must have been very, very surprising. And this made apparently the news. There was several quite extensive newspaper articles that can be found in Arcanum, the Hungarian version of newspapers.com.
Yeah, so I misspoke. I said Budapest, so I apologize for that. It was in Szentes. So even more of a interesting connection there because it was in more of a rural space than the city of Budapest. So that would be the lingua franca connection, would it not be at that time?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, it's definitely English being used in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another connection with the English teaching is that, and Nóra, I don't think I mentioned this to you. I presented a conference paper in Szentes, and I presented a paper about your family. This was a shortened version of what we were just talking about. And your family is definitely remembered in Szentes. There were people in the audience who knew of your family. And also in the questions, a woman in her 70s stood up and said that she had learned her first English words from your grandmother.
Wow.
Which is quite interesting. Yeah.
Wow,
So,
it is. It's great.
And I think this gave us the first kind of inkling that, there was a living connection there. Because one of the things that Anna and I talked about is that we're researching this, we're writing this, but we don't really know anything about their descendants. And we had no way of contacting anybody. And I think this is our first hint that there were people out there, your family's remembered, and now we're in contact with you. And that's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's as though your historical research had come to life at that time, which is pretty amazing. So, Nóra, were you researching your genealogy, or was it just like a passing thing prior to meeting Don and Anna and this whole story?
I was actually interested in my family history, but not that heavily.
Right.
And actually, Anna and Don's work just somehow ignite this whole interest in me, and it gave life to certain people in my history. And as a matter of fact, my grandmother didn't really like to talk too much about her parents and her deceased brother, because she got so sad when she started to talk about them. She started to cry, and heavy feelings appeared, and I didn't want to force her, but right now it's completely different. I'm all alone in this, and I'm so interested, and I can't express enough that I have a sense of belonging finally.
Yeah. The not speaking of your past, I think was very typical in my family as well, even though I knew a lot. And because of the hurtful emotions that sometimes are attached to those things. So, and it's not easy when you're alone in your adventure. So I feel like it was very lucky that, you joined the Facebook group and that you found Don and Nóra, and now, did you even expect that this would be happening, right? A year or two ago? Like, it's amazing how quickly life can change. And I feel as though there was a quote at the end of the entry for your family story, and I'm going to read that quote. And it says, "The American experience changed Rózsavölgyi's trajectories in life, making them act in very different ways to the situations which fate placed them than would have been usual for Hungarians in their positions at this tumultuous time in history. America does this. It changes you." So this is a great example, your family story, about how America changed your ancestors' lives, but not just their lives, your life as well. Because even before you met Don and Anna, by learning English, by being influenced like that, it has changed you. Do you see the difference in your life and your children's lives compared to, say, maybe your colleagues or your neighbors, as far as the influence that your family has given you because of their American experience?
Well, I would say it's mainly about knowing the language and turning to real sources when we consume news, so we can immediately read real sources, and we can immediately understand happenings all around the world,
Right.
and for example, as soon as my children started talking, I immediately started to teach them English. And this was my main priority for them, to learn English on a really high level. That was the main thing, I would say. Yeah. And a certain openness to the world. So one of my biggest heritage from my grandma is a certain kind of openness to the world, to be open to other cultures, to other type of existences, I would say.
Sure. Yeah. And I think living in 2025, which where we're living now, at least as an American, you assume that everyone else is also teaching their children to be as open to other experiences and other cultures. And I'm not saying that Hungarians aren't. I'm just saying in general, I guess we expect that. And maybe that's why we are received in other countries differently, as maybe being loud and whatever the stereotypes may be. I own them and I'm fine with that. But that's great that the American experience has also trickled down into your life as well and your children's lives. So I'm going to give this question to Don now. You're an American. You've been influenced by the American experience, but you live in Hungary now. So it's kind of the reverse. So
That's right.
So tell us about that experience.
That's right. So in a sense, I'm an immigrant as well, although my experience of immigration is completely different from the experiences of Hungarians over the past, 150 years. It's kind of hard to find a parallel. Probably my experience is similar to people moving around the EU these days, someone leaving Germany, going to Spain, something like that. But it's been quite interesting being here, because being an immigrant, the kind of immigrant that I am, you have this sort of insider and outsider point of view. And so I feel after all these years, I have this insider point of view of Hungary and this kind of very unique place. And also, I'm still an outsider looking at it from the outside point of view. And what's so unique for me is seeing a group of people who I think have a very clear identity, a sense of what their own identity is, of who they are culturally, linguistically, historically. Now, Americans do too have this sense of who they are, and identity, but there's quite a lot of diversity in America. Sure. And I think the American identity is centered around more like institutions and things like that, and this history of democracy and things.
Right.
And here,
more of the patriotism of the country, the patriotism, not necessarily like the heritage of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then here there's this very clear identity, which has been great to experience as an insider and feel, in a sense, like I'm a part of it. So that's been, and I have to say, it is a great honor to feel like an insider. And so one of the interesting things is to hear these stories of Hungarian immigration, because of course they're quite different than my story, but it's also stories about immigrants, and you feel something very deeply about that. And so that's been something that's been really neat.
Yeah. So you have the reverse experience, and I'm sure that it's probably an easy answer, but probably easier to be an American immigrant in Hungary in present day than, say, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. I'm sure it
I would
was a
think
little
so.
bit easier of a transition
I would think so.
because of the lingua franca, of
Right.
more people using English as
That's right.
the common language, which is
That's right.
great,
Yeah.
which is great. So I'm going to ask my co-host Anna the same question, because you've been in and out of the United States throughout your life, even though you are a native Hungarian. What has your experience been like with America changing you? Like when you go back home, do people say to you like, "Oh, like America's changed you," or like, "Oh, you say this now," or "You don't say this properly anymore," or what's your experience been like?
Yeah, well, America definitely changed me, and in the story, I was the person of the two of us who wrote that sentence because
Mm-hmm.
that was the idea that resonated most strongly with me.
Right.
Because I mean, I was of the generation of Hungarians who took their first chance to come to the United States to study uh, in graduate school, because at the time Hungary did not have PhD programs. It was not possible to go through graduate school in Hungary. So I applied in 1990 and was accepted in 1991. Came to Pittsburgh for 5 years, and that definitely changed me. That shaped me who I became professionally and also personally. And then I lived another year in the United States teaching linguistics after I got my PhD. So, and then in the past five months, I've been on this Fulbright grant in West Virginia at the University of West Virginia in Morgantown, and I definitely felt throughout all of this time living in the United States that yes, America changed me, and the American experience changed me because I became a very different person than I probably would have been if I had not come here.
Right.
I can't exactly tell you. I mean, I like to sort of psychologize myself and,
Right.
and sort of think about, how I changed, but I can't really put my finger on it. But I think what Nóra said is very true also, that I became more open, more receptive to ideas and things which were not necessarily always in front of me in Hungary, but sort of this broader frame of mind. Also, whenever I'm in the US, I feel like, yes, this is the land of infinite possibilities, and I feel like, oh, I can do all sorts of creative things which I don't necessarily feel when I'm back in Hungary. Maybe that's because I'm back in Hungary. I'm doing my job teaching and the nose to the grindstone kind of things.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so
That was well
resonated
said. Do you
with me.
feel like, I'm not sure if you've visited the US in between like your original master's program and this recent Fulbright research? I'm sure you have, but have you
Hmm.
seen a difference in present day where you've just recently done your research compared to when you first visited as a master's student?
Yeah, well, I mean, my research back then and now also has been focused on
Mm.
Hungarians and I mean
Right.
Hungarian immigrants and their descendants in the United States, and I'm basically back in a pretty much the same area where I was during grad school. And the most notable difference, of course, is that back in the 1990s, there were large Hungarian-speaking
Mm.
communities all
Right.
around here. And now there isn't anymore. I mean, there are still, of course, individuals speaking Hungarian, maybe in southwestern Pennsylvania more than
Mhm.
in West Virginia.
Right. So that's pretty interesting how the places that we immigrate to, that it definitely changes us. And that was a very big factor in Nóra and your family's experience and how it became a story in Hungarian Roots and American Dreams.
One thing that we did not touch upon at all, and the fact that how we found out about this bombing mission, the result of which was that the pilots found themselves in Szentes. I mean, that's a pretty fascinating story, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the
Please tell us about
the,
that.
the bombardment group
Hmm.
newsletter from the 1980s.
Okay. Tell us about that.
You
Right.
found,
So there were
yeah.
there were a variety of sources that we from which we found out about the Rózsavölgyi story, and one was this bomber group, which had these reunions over the years, way up until the 1980s. And they produced a newsletter, and in it they were recounting the stories, and they told the story, they reported the story about being hosted by the Rózsavölgyi family. And in that, and said how nice it was that they were, kind to them and treated them well and everything. So there were on the American side, the people who had met the family, they were getting together throughout the years as well, and talking about the same event all the way up into the 1980s.
Wow, that's pretty fascinating that people continue to meet and recount these stories because they, I guess these were really important moments in their lives, those traumatic experiences. And, we do tend to bond over trauma or shared traumas because it does help us move forward. I'm not a psychologist, but I've heard things like that. So that's pretty fascinating. Is there anything else about this bombardment group that you feel is interesting to share?
Yeah, so in this newsletter, I mean, basically they reproduced the entire incidents report. I think that's what it was called.
Wow.
And with surgical precision, recounted how they flew from southern Italy, from Bari to up to what is now Poland, which used to be the Third Reich, and to bomb a chemical plant, and how they had to leave the formation of planes because their plane was shot, and so they decided to return to Italy and flew over Hungary, and then over Hungary there the plane developed mechanical problems, so the pilots decided to cross into Allied controlled territory, which was of course controlled by the Russians, who were moving west, and in December 1944, and then when they crossed into Allied controlled territory, the Russians shot at them, probably by accident, and that contributed to the complete failure of the engines. And so the pilots and the crew, I think it was like a 7 or 8-person crew.
I think 10 people on the plane.
10 people. Yeah, they decided to bail, and most of them bailed over Jakobszálás, I think. Jakobszálás, just outside of Kecskemét, and then after the crew members parachuted themselves to safety, then the 2 pilots left the plane, and that's how they ended up quite a bit further east in Szentes. And you can find out all about this from the newsletter that is now that was written in the 1980s and is now up on the internet. And luckily they mentioned Dr. Rózsavölgyi by name, and that's how the document could be found. Actually, if you sort of Google his name and put in some other details in English, then boom, the newsletter comes up.
So this newsletter was created like from these reunions of people in the family, and they recounted this surgically, as you said. Is that just because they wanted to recall the incident and remember it historically? Is that why that was created as more of like a commemoration, essentially, of the time?
I think so.
Okay. I mean, there are similar things that Don could probably attest to in the US where people, they act out like Civil War battles. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So to me, that's like a parallel type of thing to, continue that the retelling of the story. And, that's how history is remembered, is the retelling of stories, whether it's in a textbook or like acting out like Civil War battles with your group of friends as a hobby, or this newsletter of which you speak for the pilots' families of recounting. That's pretty amazing that happened. And I have to say, overall, if we look at this story as an equation, and I'm not a mathematician, but there are a lot of variables that needed to be solved in this equation for this story to come to fruition. I feel like if this didn't happen, then that wouldn't happen. And then a lot of very interesting things that could have gone a different way. And the 4 of us wouldn't be sitting here today talking.
I think that was such a fascinating thing, just a moment in time, and you sort of bump it and look in and see what's going on. And there are all of these family histories, personal histories, all interacting in those few days. as well.
It's pretty crazy.
And there's actually one more piece to this whole picture, which I'd like to mention, and that is that this 99th Bombardment Group's newsletter also contained all the names of the pilots and the rest of the crew. And so, me being kind of hung up on all sorts of little research about who was who and did what, I looked into who these pilots were, and it turned out that one of they were in their early 20s in 1944. One of them actually died a month later over Austria in another mission. He did not survive it. But the other pilot, a man named John B. Clark, he returned back to the US after the war, married his girlfriend. They had a family, they had 3 children, and I managed to track down one of his children. And the daughter of this former pilot who actually died back in the 1960s, she is still alive. Her name is Susanna, and she is in her mid-70s. And I found her address. I sent her the story, and she was absolutely flabbergasted because she never knew what happened to her father in the war. He never talked about his plane being downed. He never talked about anything that happened to him in the war. He was just he returned from the war, and that's all the family knew, or at least that's all the children that his children knew. Yeah, she found out about this pretty major event in her father's life from this story. And I talked to her several times on the phone. She does not use the internet, so the telephoning her is the only way to get in touch. But she was very, very surprised and very grateful to find out something about her father, basically 50 years after he died, that she never knew about him, and definitely sort of new details about his life.
In addition to your work as a professor at the University of Szeged, you've kind of come up with a hobby profession of helping other people find out about their family's genealogy, like through your interest in researching all of these things. I feel like that could be a very typical American talk show of surprising people about their family history. So don't forget about that. I think that could be like your 2.0 in life when you retire.
My sidekick.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, it certainly was my pleasure to have all of you here today in this collaborative series. Anna, thank you so much for being my co-host. It's a pleasure. And Anna will be back as my co-host for some additional episodes. And Don, thank you so much for filling us in on some of the research behind the story. And Nóra, thank you for being here today and allowing us to tell about your family's story. And I look forward to speaking to all of you more in detail. Don, I would love to speak to you a little bit more about your work. I think you've got an episode.
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, I think you have an episode in there. I'm leaning toward lingua franca, but you can decide. And Nóra, I would love to speak to you more too, because I feel like being an English teacher in Hungary, that would be pretty fascinating to talk about and your experience with that. So we can talk more outside of this.
It would be my pleasure.
Thank you so much, all of you, Anna, especially for being my co-host on this episode of the Hungarian Heritage Podcast in this collaborative series of Celebrating Hungarian Heritage Together. And if you haven't had the opportunity to listen to the episode with Anna Fenyvesi and Reka Bakos, please go back and do that. They tell all about their new book. Thank you so much, Anna, Nóra, and Don. It has been my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Christine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure to be on the show.
Thanks for joining me and my co-host, Dr. Anna Fenyvesi, on this episode of the Hungarian Heritage Podcast. We were both delighted to celebrate Hungarian heritage together with our 2 guests, Dr. Don Peckham and Nóra Szentgyörgi, as we unpacked their serendipitous meeting and the fascinating story of Dr. Rózsavölgyi's Hungarian heritage story. If you are interested in hearing more Hungarian heritage stories from the Hungarian Roots and American Dreams book, you can purchase a copy either in English or in Hungarian. That information will be located in the show notes. If you are interested in joining the Facebook group that was mentioned in this episode, you will also find that information in the show notes, as well as how you can get in contact with Dr. Anna Fenyvesi or Reka Bakos, the editors of Hungarian Roots and American Dreams. If you have feedback or questions about this episode, or you would like to connect with me at the podcast, you will also find that information in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode and you're interested in learning more about this Hungarian heritage community, please do not hesitate to reach out. I would love to hear from you. Our theme music is Hungarian Dance by Pony Music, used with special license from Envato Market. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, make sure you stay Hungarian heritage strong. See you, Stoke!